Today on Locked On Canadians, I have a very special guest joining me, a prospect expert. We're going to talk Reinbacher, past, present, future, Lane Hutson. We're going to talk about it all right now.
You are Locked On Canadiens, your daily podcast on the Montreal Canadiens, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi there, everyone, and welcome to episode 1038. We want to thank you for making us your first listen of the day every day. As you know, we're free and available wherever you get your podcasts, as well as here on YouTube. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. My name is Laura Sab, also known as the Active Stick. And today I am not joined, as always, by the wonderful Scott Matla. He is away on business, and instead I'm doing a solo show. No, actually, I'm not. I have a very special guest. We want to talk Reinbacher. We want to talk about the scouting reports prior to Laval, his Laval debut, and where he's going in the future. So today's episode has all of that. And to that end, I have here with me one half of the Locked On NHL Prospects podcast, which you can find anywhere you get this podcast. Sebastian High is here once again to talk about David Reinbacher. Sebastian, how excited are you to talk about this Canadiens draft pick, or now prospect?
Very. I mean, he's been off to an electric start so far with the Laval Rocket, and we've been taking the opportunity at Locked On Prospects to chat about him too. So we had a full episode dedicated to Reinbacher there as well. So lots of Reinbacher talk going around right now.
Yes, and honestly, for me, that's how I like it, because it's been a while since we've had something to be this excited about. I would say it's been some months. I think Slavkovsky's breakout was probably the last thing we were this excited about. So, Sebastian, why don't you take us back? Because I believe it was on this very show as well that you initially shared your thoughts before Reinbacher was drafted.
Yeah, it was. This was back in January of 2023 when he wasn't all that big on the map just yet. I remember it being a hot take then to say that he'd be the first defenseman selected in that 2023 NHL draft class. And that ended up happening. So not so much of a hot take now, I guess. But yeah, no, it's been a lot since then. But I think that his projection and style of play have stayed remarkably consistent throughout that period of time. That's one big thing with Reinbacher's game. It's consistency.
And honestly, for me, that's the biggest thing, is that, whatever you thought of the pick at the time, and as we were on the record, we can't go back and change it. I was on the record personally, as was my co-host Scott, saying we wanted a forward with explosive offense picked in that spot. But this upcoming year, and we'll talk a little bit about strategy a little bit later in this show, but this upcoming year has a lot of defensemen. So a lot of our listeners have pointed out maybe the Canadiens wanted to get that out of the way early. But for me, I think what they thought at the time was, is this guy going to be able to play in the system with these particular prospects? As we know, they've got a lot of D prospects. They don't necessarily have right now much of a plan. So I think for the Canadiens, I feel like somebody who fit into a plan or an identity of how they wanted to play. And the fact that he's reliable. I think the biggest thing is that this pick, it wasn't inspired because it wasn't one of those, high ceiling, but also high risk prospects. This is a high ceiling, but low risk prospect.
For sure. David Reinbacher could very conceivably become a number 2 defenseman in the NHL. I think that is odds of becoming a number 3 are maybe a bit more likely, but depending on his development, he could definitely reach that top pairing upside in the right scenario. I think he would need a certain aspects of his game mitigated with a good fit as a D partner. But hey, the Habs are lucky enough to have Lane Hutson in their system too. So you already have a pretty complementary match right there that could be a pretty balanced and dynamic and also relatively reliable top pairing if both of their developments continue in their current trends.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, it's assuming everything goes right, their development pans out as expected. We are very excited about Lane Hutson, but I want to ask, really, what are the things that you've seen since the moment that he's been drafted to before he was called over to the Laval Rocket? Like, what were things that you saw in his game this past season that gave you hope or made you feel positive about the prospect, or gave you an idea of what direction they should take his development in?
Yeah, so he played in Cloton this season, which I mean everyone's already been talking about a bunch, but it was not the ideal environment to develop in. Like it was very chaotic in terms of the systems. It had like two coaching changes, and the systems were just constantly being upended. There was no clear identity. They were playing dump and chase hockey with a passive forecheck, and when they did recover pucks on the forecheck, there was rarely a plan of what to do with possession down low in the offensive zone. And it basically just meant that whenever they had the puck in the offensive zone, Reinbacher was just stapled to the blue line because like the very conceivable thing to predict coming up in the next 3 seconds was a turnover and having to backtrack. So there was little like activation offensively for him, but we've already seen in the first couple games in Laval that he's been activating a lot more comfortably because there's an increased level of trust in the system itself. But the one thing I do think that benefited him from playing in Cloton was that while he wasn't able to really develop his offensive or on puck game very much at all, he was able to develop his defensive game. Because he was in this like incredibly chaotic environment I mean, they were just getting caved at 5-on-5 most of the time. He had to be really solid and really intelligent in his own zone to mitigate risk. And I saw a lot of refinement in also his like decision making speed, his processing speed in the defensive zone. He was really doubling down on his ability to defend the slot specifically, getting a lot better at clearing the net front, using his physicality to create space and like also a visual lane for his goaltender, and getting underneath opponents. He's really effective in blending his reach, his mobility, his aggression to close gaps and suffocate rushes into the boards. And he used those same tools while defending the cycle. He can go out and attack the puck carrier, and then circle back and defend the slot before there's a real big risk of the puck getting there instead. And when he gets to a position where he can really put a lot of trust in not only his deep partner, but in his forwards as well, and can have some trust in the system he's playing in, I think that he's going to be gaining a lot of comfort. And what a comfortable Reinbacher is a Reinbacher who's willing to test out his abilities a little bit more. And that includes taking some on-puck risks. And that's very exciting for me.
And honestly, it does feel, and I will admit that I did not watch any of his previous games, but as soon as he's called over, as soon as he starts playing, obviously all of us as Habs fans were glued to our TVs, or our computers, trying to get as much of Reinbacher as we could, and it felt like sometimes you have a player that gets free, like he's playing under a really oppressive system, like, and all of a sudden there's a little bit more creativity in the new system that he gets traded to or whatever. That's the kind of player he reminded me of. It looked like he was sprung, right? Like he's free. I do want to talk about Laval in a quick second, but I want to stick real quick to the one thing, like if you were to say one thing that he's going to be able to do now in the Canadian system that you don't think he had the opportunity to do before, what aspect of his game do you think will be most improved?
I think it's going to be most of the offensive game, especially the on-puck game, especially like in terms of being able to refine his handling skill. I mean, of course, his first AHL goal came like a day after I posted a big in-depth video analysis thread that highlighted his handling as his biggest weakness, and he went out and went for a full toe drag in the neutral zone, scored off the rush, right? But
He heard you
uh,
talking, Sebastian.
he, he heard me talking, right? Like, yeah, for sure. But yeah, I still do think that the handling is an area of improvement, especially in terms of like he can be quite rigid when he's catching pucks on his backhand. His first touch can often be a little bit iffy, and just in terms of moving the puck up ice, it's rarely as smooth as that sequence looked. But if he can gain a lot more consistency in being able to apply his intelligence and his sense of pressure to kind of give himself some freedom to test out some handling and kind of unlock his top hand and get a bit more comfortable with handling closer into his body. I think that you're going to see a lot of offensive growth in his game, and with that will come a lot of confidence too. And one element that's quite strong in his game that he really wasn't able to test out at all this season, but was a lot more on display last year, is his ability to activate off puck in the offensive zone. We saw this a ton in the Habs training camp and in preseason, where he's really able to activate up into that middle and high slot. He's really capable at getting open and finding soft ice in there. He plays within blind spots of other defenders really nicely and is a decent shooting threat when he has a little bit of time and space. He still has to work on being able to get off his release, a threatening release really quickly and in tight. Again, he needs a little bit of that extra length because he has a pretty long reach with a long stick. He needs a little bit more space to be able to get off the threatening shot. So being able to work on like it, which you can do in drills very easily, and I'm sure Adam Nicholas is going to help him on this, is to get off shots from more uncomfortable positions. And overall, I think there's definitely some room to grow offensively. I don't think he's ever going to be like a 50-point guy from the blue line, but if you're able to unlock that like 40-point upside, if he's playing with a guy like Lane Hutson, like you're going to get a lot of secondary assists playing with him. But I definitely think he could be that like Jeff Petrie type of production, not style, but production. If the Habs are a contending team, I think there is that level of upside with David Reinbacher, but getting to just get a lot more on-puck reps in Laval is going to be key for that, because the on-puck reps in Cloton this year were really limited.
And speaking of that, in our next segment, we're going to focus a little bit on the games he's played in Laval so far, and the outlook as the Laval Rocket desperately try to make the playoffs. And that's coming up in just one moment. And today's episode is brought to you by Sleeper. We've been talking all about Reinbacher, but guess what? The Montreal Canadiens have had a very strange season. But regardless of where the Habs are in the current standings or where they're going, I want to remind everyone that you could win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports and especially daily fantasy hockey, because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. And all you have to do, it's so easy. You can play any sport actually, but we're here to talk about the NHL. And I'm telling you, entries can be made in under a minute. And all you have to do is pick players and then pick whether they'll record more or less than their sleeper projections for things like goals, assists, saves, plus minus, and more in a given game. And to win 100 times your cash on Sleeper, you just need to correctly predict the outcome of 8 player stats. Start paying attention and nail your picks so you can start winning big. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. All right, let's get to talking about Laval. So, Sebastian, how many times did you watch the games that David Reinbacher played this past weekend?
I watched a bit of all three. I watched the second and third periods of his debut. I watched the third period of the second game against Belleville, and I watched another period or two against the Marlies. So I watched a little bit of each game and thought that he got more and more comfortable as his reps increased. I know my co-host over at Locked On NHL Prospects, Hadi Kalakesh, he watched the entirety of the first game, and he was telling me that the first period was a little bit more erratic for Reinbacher in that debut, but that he really has settled down by the time I tuned in the second period. And Reinbacher said the same thing as well in an interview, that he had some nerves going into it, but once he felt settled in the middle of the game, he really started feeling a lot more confident, and that was definitely reflected in his play on the ice. And I mean, he was really able to showcase his biggest strengths, like his ability to keep really tight gaps, match footwork beautifully of opposing rushers, whether they had the puck or not. He really keeps himself within a single stride of opposing forwards when he's tracking them, and he can close his gaps and so aggressively, and he covers so much ice. Like he plays defensively in a pretty similar way to Caden Gooley, which I think a bunch of Habs fans are going to be very excited to hear and see as well moving forward.
And Caden Gooley's panning out pretty well, this season. Even though he's taken a step back, he's still one of the best players the Canadians have right now. And so I did want to talk a little bit about the outlook for Laval. Like who do you think he should be playing with for the foreseeable future? And what impact do you think he can have on this team that's been riddled with injuries and some bad luck and now is desperately trying to get into playoff contention?
I mean, yeah, like I definitely think that he can make a big impact. I mean, Laval has just a massive luxury of having three pretty high end right shot defensemen throughout their defensive core there, right? With like Logan Mailloux and Justin Barron as well. Like you have three solid options, and I don't really know if there's a very clear 1-2-3 between those three players. You can even like pair up two of them. I think that Mailloux and Reinbach would be a stylistic, pretty good match if you want to play two righties in a single pairing. But if you're talking about the left shot Ds, I saw him play a little bit with Toby Bisson, and I liked that pairing quite a bit. I thought that they complement each other quite nicely in the defensive zone. Also, being able to play with an older player as a 19-year-old coming over to North America, I think definitely has some positives. But the nice thing with Reinbacher is that he doesn't really rely too much on playing with any specific prototype of player in order to be effective and play his game. There's definitely certain players that he'd be matched with where he'd be in a bit more of an offensive role or a bit more of a defensive role, depending how they play, but he can really adapt to those situations. But in terms of being able to make an impact with the Rocket, I mean, he already is, right? Like he scored that beautiful goal in his debut. He added an assist against the Marlies, and he was on the ice for all four non-empty net all three non-empty net goals in that game as well. Like he was always on the ice when good things were happening for Laval, and I already think that he's like as good or better than Mailloux and Barron. So. Like he's going to need some time, obviously, to adapt. I think it's wise that the Habs are just going to keep him in Laval for the rest of the season and not call him up. I'd love to see him get like 75% of his season in the AHL next year as well. I think the patient approach and allowing him to really work slowly and steadily on his on-puck game would really raise his ceiling offensively. And if you rush him to the NHL, he might just get pigeonholed as like a defense-first guy. And I think that could really cap his ceiling as a number 3. And if the Habs want to get as much as they can out of their 5th overall pick, I'd think the patient approach, which they're seeming to want to take here, is a pretty wise one. But yeah, I definitely think he's going to be a key piece for Laval in this playoff push. And once they make the playoffs, if they do, I would adore to see a pairing of him and Jaden Struble. I think that would be perfect for both of them. It would just be beautiful to watch. First pairing of Struble and Reinbacher going into the AHL playoffs. Sign me up. That'd be a blast.
Let's be careful because every time we get excited about a thing, said thing gets injured. But, to your point with him playing in Laval next year, there are 2 other people in Laval currently right now who will be fighting for that spot. That, I feel like there's 1 spot, 3 RD, or like right-handed D, right? So there's a pretty good chance that somebody else beats him to it. I feel like somebody like Justin Barron has a lot to prove. Logan Mailloux definitely would have that drive to try and make it in. So there's the competition's going to be pretty stiff. And I think it would be smarter for the Canadians to go with somebody who has more experience and put them in the NHL at the moment. Particularly because one of those 3 is eventually going to be a trade piece. And I don't think they're going to be trading their 5th overall pick. That's not happening, right?
That's not why you picked him.
Yeah, exactly. You picked him to be part of your core in the future. And so I think from my perspective, one of the things the Canadians desperately need is throughout their organization, like the injuries need to stop just so that they can get some consistent playing time together and consistent development, right? Like it feels like every time a player either breaks out or finds his game again, they get injured and it's, everything gets thrown into a mess. But, one thing that you said specifically is that Reinbacher is the kind of guy that you can play with many different partners and in different situations. And from my perspective, I think that speaks a lot to his consistency that also you brought up earlier. But I feel like sometimes it gets lost given the circumstances of his draft that he does have that ability to be creative. Like it's not Lane Hutson level creative, right? But he does have the smarts. He has that hockey sense.
Yes, like I think specifically his vision of the game is very strong. He sees the ice well. He sees his options very well. It's one of the reasons that he's a really good breakout passer. Specifically, is that when the play's in front of him and he sees it, like all its mechanisms developing, he makes the right choice very consistently. And it's often not the easiest play either. But he keeps an easy play in his back pocket if he's being pressured. But he reads the game really well. So I think with time there's definitely room to grow in the offensive zone and with the offensive upside. I don't know if creativity itself is the word that I would use. I think that he's very intelligent in terms of being able to put himself in situations where he can make high-end plays rather than necessarily creating them out of thin air. He gets to spots where he can make decent plays and get the puck towards a higher danger area. There's definitely room to grow as well in terms of being able to leverage his like really high-end passing ability into a bigger playmaking role. I'd love to see him play on like a PP2 next season with Laval. Like I think Mayu's pretty much staple to that first power play, and Justin Barron I think is either like he's going to lose waiver eligibility next season, so he'll either be with the Habs or traded or waived, right? So he's not
Right.
going to be in Laval. And it'll open up that second power play spot. And I definitely want to give Reinbacher some of those reps. I think there's room to grow. And if you end up playing Reinbacher on like the first pairing, first PK, second power play, give him those 23 minutes a night for like almost an entire season, if not an entire season, depending on how things go in Montreal injury wise and where they stand in the standings, if they're making a playoff push or whatnot. But I'd want to give him a decent chunk of time with consistent minutes, consistent opportunities in all situations, and just allow him to explore his game a little bit, which was not really an opportunity he had this year as a D+1 in Cloton, but that ability to explore and also refine some of his tools, especially on puck, then I think we're going to have a much better idea of what the true high-end upside really could be in terms of the offensive side of the game. Like the defensive side of the game, Reinbacher, like he could already be a really solid bottom pairing NHL defenseman that you can trust in the defensive zone, that you can put over the boards in the last 2 minutes of a game without really being stressed in any way, shape, or form. But in terms of being able to leverage his tools offensively, that's where there's still a lot of refinement that I still think can be needed, and also where there's added consistency issues that still have to be ironed out a little bit.
So would you say instead of saying he was creative, that it's probably better to say he's got good decision making ability in the offensive zone?
Yeah, like offensively, he's more of like a facilitator and a play connector than he is a creator. So he can get the he gets the puck very consistently to the players that can create. So I think he'd be a decent enough like PP2 option, even long term with the Habs. Like especially if you have a second power play that you can have players like Kirby Doc and Alex Newhook, right, where you can get them the puck and they can really create things with it.
Hmm.
If you have a player like Reinbacher that can kind of just be the general from the blue line and decide, okay, looking at the defensive structure, I want to now attack on the left side or the right side, and is always making himself open as an outlet option. He's very good at that, actually. As on the power play, is making himself a constant option whenever like his puck carrying teammate is being pressured, to make sure that there's an open lane between that teammate and him, that he's always open for that outlet. But he's not going to be the primary player that's going to get the primary assist, but he could be like a secondary assist merchant because he is just constantly getting the puck to areas where dangerous plays can be created.
And in our final segment, we're going to get really excited because you heard the name Lane Hutson, and I'm going to bring him up again because I want to hear all about the potential for this potential pairing. We don't know if it's happening, but we think it could, and that's coming up in just one moment here on Locked On Canadiens. All right, is it Lane Hutson time?
It's Lane Hutson time.
All right, let's talk about Lane Hutson. So obviously, Scott and I have a very heavy Hudson for Hobie campaign going right now. And, for whatever reason, the moment that they put these two players together in, I want to say, was it development camp? It was development camp because Hudson was not eligible for training camp, right? The second they started playing together, I don't know what it was. It was like a 3-on-3 scrum or something. I can't even remember. And then immediately people saw the chemistry that they had. You were talking about some of the things that are needed to complement Reinbacher's game, and it feels like Lane Hutson's that player to bring that. But also on the flip side, some of Lane Hutson's weaknesses, which he does have, he's not perfect. He's amazing, but he's not perfect. There are some weaknesses to his game. It feels like Reinbacher can sort of help shelter and camouflage that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So Lane Hutson, as you mentioned, is not a perfect player. Much of as a fan as you and I are of this player, and I mean, we've been talking about him for about 2 years at this point. Like, I remember my first appearance on the podcast was back in 2022.
You were Lane Hutson hipster. Lane Hutson, you were honestly one of the first people to talk about him.
I had him ranked 11th overall. I had him ranked right behind Simon Nemec, right? Like I've been a big fan of him for a long time, but he's far from a perfect player. That said, David Reinbacher is as great of a stylistic match as I can really think of for a player like Lane Hutson in terms of being able to consistently get him the puck, in terms of also being a really capable breakout passer that Lane Hutson doesn't have to have 100% of the transition burden on his shoulders, and that in the offensive zone, Reinbacher excels at just being able to give possession to his teammates that he believes can create. And Lane Hutson can do many things, and create is about 90% of them, right? So I think it's a really good stylistic match. They balance out each other's weaknesses really well, where Lane Hutson, he can be beaten on the rush pretty easily in terms of his pivot still being a bit of an issue. He can still have struggles in terms of being able to catch up to play when it gets past him. And Reinbacher is one of the better players outside the NHL today in terms of being able to make up ground, cover a ton of ice, get back defensively, and get a stick immediately into the most dangerous passing lane, or getting it under the opponent and doing so without taking a penalty. So in terms of a pairing mate that can mitigate risk, and there will be risk with Lane Hutson in the NHL. If there isn't, you're not getting the most out of Lane Hutson. I think that Reinbacher will complement him really nicely. And on top of that, if, for instance, next season Lane Hutson's playing in the AHL and the Habs decide to call up Reinbacher first between the two, which I think is thoroughly possible in terms of stylistically being a little bit better with risk taking and there being less risk with him.
Mm-hmm.
I think
especially if they're positioned to try and fight for a wild card spot.
Exactly.
Yeah. Every point's going to matter.
If it's going to be about you need to be able to shut down 1-goal leads, right? You're going to be wanting to have David Reinbacher in your lineup rather than Lane Hutson in all likelihood. But I think playing with a guy like Mike Matheson would be the perfect also training ground for playing with Lane Hutson at the NHL level. And on top of that, there might just also be a Hutson Reinbacher pair in Laval next year, right? So that can be built on that front. But I think that Hutson will be able to learn a lot from Reinbacher in the defensive zone in terms of being able to close gaps more efficiently, in terms of being able to learn the small intricacies a bit more. And he's definitely progressed on this front since his draft year. His transition defending's become a lot better than it was in his draft year. I was watching the Hockey East final between Boston College and Boston University, and Hutson had a couple really nice defensive plays against 2-on-1 rushes where he had a really well-timed stick check, and he's such an intelligent player. He's learning how to integrate a ton of different styles of play in order to put the best results on the ice. But playing with Reinbacher would teach him a lot in the defensive zone. And on top of that, playing with Hutson would also teach Reinbacher a lot in terms of playing with the puck, in terms of being able to leverage his strengths to create those advantages, to create space for himself, and then what to do with that space when he creates it. Like there are times where Reinbacher creates space really well for himself, whether it be through like physicality and puck protection or just his mobility, and then slight hesitation on what to do with it. Lane Hutson does not have that type of hesitation in his game with the puck on his stick offensively. So on top of just being able to like be very complementary on the ice, I think they'd also really be able to address their own weaknesses by studying the games of their defensive partners, which in my eyes makes the foundation of a potentially excellent defensive pairing long term.
And everything we know about both of these players is, as we keep saying, they are smart players. They're very smart players. And bringing out the best in each other is kind of an advantage of that. Like I also, it's something that I always talk about Nick Suzuki doing, like really studying the game and finding all the little things that he can be better at. Like he knows he's good at this thing, but he's not just going to rest on his laurels, right? Like he's going to look at every little tiny thing and then find ways to improve it. And these two players, I feel like they're like, that's their approach to the game, particularly Lane Hutson. Like he's shown so much, I like to call it chutzpah, like just so much of that over the course of, like since he's become, a draft eligible prospect. And so it looks to me like they would be able to utilize each other's skills, and they both seem confident and bold enough to be able to have that open communication relationship, kind of like how Nick Suzuki and Cole Caulfield have, right? Like they communicate really well, they bring out the best in each other, and then at a certain point it becomes almost almost telepathic, right? The way they communicate on the ice.
For sure, and this would also be a benefit of we'll see if Lane Hutson forces the Canadiens' hand to keep him in the NHL next season. But if he starts out in the AHL for a little bit next year before getting a call up for whatever reason, I mean, the Habs have a log jam at D. Like they have like how many lefties ahead? Like they have like Struble, Harris, Jackeye,
Yeah,
Matheson. Like there's a lot of bodies, right?
yeah.
But
Um,
if they start out with Hutson in the AHL, being able to already set the foundations of the chemistry between those two players, I think would just be a real, like wonderful thing to work with in Laval. And it would also just ease both of their transitions of, for instance, if they're starting out playing together in Laval and they get their own separate call-ups over the course of the season, being able to just resume their partnership at the NHL level will add a ton of comfort too, in terms of being familiar with each other's habits and how they approach the game and how they can time each other's plays with the others. So I think that there's a lot of foundation for an exciting defensive partnership here long term, and doesn't really matter if they start out in the AHL or the NHL. I think there's going to be a lot of growth with those two players because they would also be able to mitigate each other's weaknesses so well.
and speaking of exciting things, tell people where they can find your work and your co-host work and all of that fun stuff.
For sure. So Locked On NHL Prospects, you can find that on YouTube or your favorite audio podcasting platform. On Twitter, LO_NHL Prospects is where you can find our work. And for me personally, it's High_Sebastian on Twitter. Like all of my work is centralized there. When I do something, I usually post it there. And last but not least, if you want like the real nitty gritty work that we do, go Dauber Prospects. That's where we've got all of your prospect content as well. We're gonna come out with our second midterm, like April rankings in the middle of the month before the U18 World Championships kick off, and that's probably going to be a top 100 ranking. So lots to look forward to there. I mean, we're entering like the peak season of draft year, so a lot of our work is finally getting a bit more showcased. But we've got a ton of content coming your way in the coming weeks and months too.
And Sebastian, will you come back in the coming weeks to promote said ranking?
Of course. I mean, whenever you want to have me on, just give me a call.
Release the ranking, and then we can have you on here so that we can explain why.
Awesome. Sounds great.
Thank you so much for your time, Sebastian.
Thanks so much.
I want to thank Sebastian once again for his time, and I want to thank all of you for listening. We hope that you got a little bit of insight as to what Reinbacher brings to the table. If you want to find us, we're available wherever you get your podcasts as well as on YouTube, so make sure you are subscribed to our podcast. You can find us on Twitter at LO_Canadians. You can leave comments in the YouTube. You can also send us mailbag questions or any thoughts or observations to lockedoncanadians@gmail.com. We love hearing from you. So please go ahead and do that. And if you want us to mention it on the mailbag, you will just need to write MBQ mailbag questions somewhere in your YouTube comment or in your tweet so that we know that you want us to bring it up on the mailbag episode. Thank you so much for listening. And we will talk to you tomorrow.